there's a way to make an entrance.
This is my destiny.
It was now a conspiracy of witches.
Download Veely today.
I would like her to return to my village and to be able to walk around the valleys and the little hills and the streams around which I grew up.
Ndiweli Milambo Enamagama is a Xhosa saying which means, I have crossed famous rivers. It refers to the sort of experience and wisdom one gets from being widely travelled. Nelson Mandela used the phrase to reflect on his early life. After crossing some important rivers, he said he realised there were many others still to come. When British forces crossed this river, the Kai, in 1835, it was to begin the final subjugation of the Transkei and its Xhosa-speaking people, among them Mandela's tribe, the Tembu. The advance of the white man had started the previous century, with Trekboers extending the limits of the Cape Colony. 9 wars were fought over 100 years. It was the longest and arguably most damaging conflict in Africa, which shaped the political consciousness of generations to come. Even in this age of rapid technological innovation, Transkei seems remote from city life. For visitors, it offers glimpses of a bygone era and of people who still seem to follow their own rhythm. This is the tail end of an Ifizatu ceremony involving the worship of ancestral spirits. It's intended to bring good luck. The Xhosa were bound in their daily lives and actions by reverence for and fear of their ancestors. A calamity could happen if the spirits were offended. But many sacred rituals and time-honored traditions have been adapted or cast aside with the passing of history. This is an increasingly rare sight, someone still practicing an authentic rural craft. The grass roofs of the beehive-shaped huts or rondavels that dot the Transkei landscape are being rapidly replaced by corrugated iron. Bundling thatch with such care now seems unnecessarily laborious. These are communities mainly of women, children, and the elderly. Most able-bodied men are away for long spells as contract labourers. When Mandela was a child, the Transkei was still able to support a peasant economy. But overcrowding in the pockets of land that had been reserved for blacks only contributed to a collapse in agriculture. Any serious farming is now carried out by only the most persistent. Mandela's boyhood memories are also of old men who could still recall a time when the Xhosa were undefeated. Their tales of brave resistance and of African tribal society, sometimes idealized, helped restore the pride of people who'd been humiliated by conquest. Any visit to Nelson Mandela's birthplace might just as well start here at the Nelson Mandela Museum in Umtata. It tells you about the struggles he faced, the victories he had. It's packed with gifts and awards from all over the world. But most importantly, it lays this region's claim to the most towering figure in South African politics. The building which houses the museum is wallowing in a newfound self-respect. Originally the centre of colonial rule in the area, it became the parliament for the nominally independent Transkei when Pretoria was pursuing its dream of geographic as well as political apartheid. In the room where only government-approved black leaders once met, giant portraits of Mandela gaze back at him. This was the official opening of the museum in 2000. Zibikele Mkhabalela works at the Nelson Mandela Museum. He's offered to take me on a tour of Mandela country. As if to assert his credentials, he proudly announces he was born in the same village as Mandela, Mvezo. Mvezo is only 70 kilometers away, but it'll be a while before it's firmly on the tourist map. The road is a driver's nightmare, deeply rutted and strewn with tire-gouging rocks. Stray animals readily take their chances with approaching vehicles. Until Mandela's release from prison, only a few people in Mvezo knew or even acknowledged that this was where he was born. Home for the Mandelas was here on the banks of the Mbashi River in Tembuland, the southern part of Transkei. Mandela's father, Gadla Henry Mpakanyiswa, was the chief or village headman of Mvezo. He was also a valued councillor to the Tembu royal family. As grand as it all sounded, Mandela said even then the role of a chief had become debased by white colonial rule. Mandela's mother, Nosekeni, was the third of his father's 4 wives. The couple had 4 children, 3 girls and Nelson.
This is the actual hut that Nelson Mandela was born in. Yeah.
How did they prove something like that, or how sure can they be that this was Mandela's birthplace?
I think we knew it through research. Mm-hmm. Yes. And Nelson Mandela visited the site, and maybe he said, this is actual hut where he was born in.
Really?
Yes.
So he remembered the exact spot himself?
Yes. Because there's nothing has changed.
In his autobiography, Nelson Mandela notes that his father was a wealthy nobleman by the standards of his time. But life was still simple. The family kraal included a few thatched huts, a fenced-in enclosure for animals, and fields for growing crops. This is the ancient grindstone that Mandela's mother once used to pound maize. According to Mandela, she was an excellent grinder. The caretaker of Mandela's ancestral kraal, John Qunu, is a fastidious man. Nobody gets out of signing the visitor's book, least of all Mandela. This was on his 87th birthday. Mandela had wanted to celebrate quietly by visiting his birthplace. A fold-up table and chairs were laid out in anticipation. These are rare pictures of Mandela enjoying the quiet surroundings of his birthplace, filmed by a member of his staff. But the tranquility was short-lived. Before long, it seemed the entire village up the hill had gate-crashed the party. Mandela appeared genuinely pleased by the invasion and insisted on being introduced to each of the children, nearly 100 in all. He's always had a special affinity with children, but these ones share his deep rural roots.
Happy birthday to you.
Those close to Mandela say he visibly relaxes here, even tucking into the champagne, although he seldom touches alcohol. Village elders from Mvezo congregate around Mandela. One of them tells Mandela how pleased they are he's there in person because they usually see him only on television. Mandela indulges their long-winded stories, just like his father would have done before he was deposed as chief of Mveza. As you can see, the Mandela family had a commanding view from here. The Mbashi River winds through the valley just beyond the cultivated land there. But the young Nelson didn't have a chance to savour the beauty of the place. He was only 2 when his father was charged with insubordination by a white magistrate. It was a pretty minor dispute over cattle, but Mandela's father rebuffed attempts by the magistrate to intervene. Since his position was as much dependent on the approval of the colonial administration as tribal lineage, the magistrate, enraged at the slight, stripped Gadla of his title and evicted him from his land.
We lost the chieftaincy in 1920 when my great-grandfather, Chief Mpakanyiswa Gadla Mandela, rejected a summon by a magistrate, a local magistrate in Piki. And by so doing, he was saying that here in Tembuland, he only recognizes the Tembu customs and the Tembu traditions. And he rejected any foreign rule or any allegiance to British colonialism.
Of the many dreams nurtured by Mandela, getting back his family land was certainly one of them. Under new laws imposed a few years before his father was evicted, black people in South Africa had lost most of their land. You needed to hang on to what you had. While Gadla's stand against the magistrate might have been laudable, it was also foolhardy. His family faced ruin. Mandela reckoned later that his father's proud rebelliousness was passed on to him. But he's here to see his grandson Mandla reclaim the traditional leadership of Mvezo. Mandla Mandela now has the power to decide disputes and to try certain criminal and civil cases. Although this kind of local rule doesn't fit easily into a modern democracy, South Africa's new constitution recognizes and protects traditional customs and laws. Some weeks later, Mandla was overseeing plans to revamp his family's historic kraal. A new great place, as the Xhosa call the seat of their chiefs, was already taking shape. Nothing too ostentatious. It's made up of a cluster of modern-day rondavels. The ruins of the original huts were also about to have replicas grafted onto them, just like it used to be, or so it was promised.
It is very important to me, before I start erecting any other roundavels, that I start with the household of my great-grandfather and ensure that it is fully intact.
But Mandela intends the family property to be more than a Mandela memorial. He wants to set up a model farm on land that's been untilled longer than anyone can remember.
My grandfather, when he tells his story, is that his father owned the land from above the hill all the way to Mbashe River. But today, with my installation, we've had to buy a lot of the land back, which was lost to us. As you know, that legally, if a person has been occupying land for more than 30 years, it becomes theirs. We've been away from Mvezo for 87 years.
Mandla's hoping to encourage the people of Mvezo to return to farming, in the same way his grandfather inspired his countrymen to reclaim their rights.
People here in Mvezo have a lot of expectations by me having the family name of the Mandelas. And we are in one of the most impoverished areas in South Africa, where people are very reliant on government grants. They're no longer working the land, doing agriculture, growing maize, wheat, sorghum. And people have just become too reliant on government grants. And by me being here, I'm hopefully going to work hand in hand with people and try and insist that they go back to their natural ways of working the land and growing maize and being able to come up with sustainable programs that will ensure that the people of Umvezo are able to develop.
Qunu is the place Nelson Mandela said he traced his earliest memories. His mother set up home here after they were evicted from Umvezo. It's a relatively short trip in a car, but quite a trek if you're doing it on foot. The young Mandela would have been carried on his mother's back all the way to Qunu, much the same way as this woman is doing. Mandela remembers Qunu as the place he spent some of the happiest years of his boyhood. Like today, it consisted of no more than a few hundred people.
Bricks and mortar are replacing a lot of the traditional housing in Qunu. This home belongs to one of Nelson Mandela's relatives, and it's on the spot where his mother built her 3 huts when she first arrived here from Umvezo in the early 1920s. And here you can just make out the circular mound that would have been the foundation of one of those huts.
People here are happy to oblige with tales about the man from their village who became president. But there aren't many who remember Mandela from his pre-prison days. His younger relatives have only dim recollections.
Ngizombona mina kwelithuba aqala usixelela ngelizwe lakhe malibuye.
From where we're sitting, you can see the home Mandela built for his retirement. These people are obviously proud of their association with him. But there was a time they could never admit to it.
Akungekho nto nandiziva ngela ixesha iphasiqithini. Akukho nto nandiziva. Kuba nam ke ndandisoyika ukuya kuye pha esiqithini. Hayi ndandisoyika.
Hayi ayizange ifike loo nto kum. Kuba ndaqiniseka uba umntu oqala uvalelwa phaa ejele ndim kunaye.
Anybody who is anybody in Qunu has a milli patch. Nombulelo Ngqebetshana is one of Mandela's nieces. If there's something she doesn't know about millis, it's not worth knowing. For generations, the millis have been harvested from the field when hard and dry and stored for later use. Rural life is often precarious, but Nombulelo Ngqebetshana had to contend with other problems.
Londo ke leyo ke lento yalo mzabalazo kwakungafuneki uthi ingwa uyayazi ngalo maxesha. Kwawufuneka uthi mandindiwasemthatha xa ndiphaya. Bazandibuza kabelungu bandazi intoni ngone wazi intoni ngoNelson Mandela. Ndithi ke mna andimazi lo mntu lo. Engwasemthatha nje ndithi umthatha Johannesburg umthatha nje ngeTransvaal le. Mkhulu ngolo hlobo asazani kangako nabantu bathesa. Uzamazi umuntu ke kufitshane kuwo. Sasibanjwa awuzobanjwa kaloku nawe. Into ndamphikelela ngawuzobanjwa kaloku ndimphika ngondimazi uba ndiyazalana naye kakhulu.
Youngsters goading cattle can be found all over the Transkei. They shoulder a big responsibility. You're looking at the family fortune here. Mandela was only 5 when he became a herd boy. In his autobiography, he wrote about the almost mystical attachment that the Xhosa have for cattle, not only as a source of food and wealth, but as a blessing from God. Mandela was never particularly religious. His father adhered to the traditional faith involving the worship of ancestral spirits. But his mother became a devout Christian at the insistence of 2 proselytizing brothers in Qunu. A Methodist, or Wesleyan church as it was then known, had been built in the 1880s at the top of a hill, probably to remind people it was there.
Sadly, this church is showing the very obvious stresses of old age. Apparently it's deteriorated quite rapidly in recent years. But this is the building where Nelson Mandela's mother brought him to be baptized at the age of 6, shortly after she converted to Christianity. Where now?
As you make your way around Qunu, even popping into the local trading store for a cool drink takes on a special significance.
this shop is where Nelson Mandela first saw a white person.
Really?
Because this shop was originally owned by the white shopkeeper.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yes.
I hadn't heard that.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder what Nelson Mandela bought all those years ago when he came here. I don't suppose it could have been a Coke. What would you like to drink?
I would like to drink lemon twist.
Could I have a lemon twist as well, please?
1 tea.
2 lemon twists, please.
The same brothers who encouraged Mandela's mother to join the Methodist Church also put pressure on her to send her son to the local mission school. For any child, it's a big step. But for Nelson, it was momentous. No one in his family had received any basic education. He was duly enrolled at the school in Qunu, and his traditional name, Kholikhlakla, was dumped on the first day, like many other mission-educated children at the time.
And there were only 4 roundabouts here. 1, 2, 3, 4. And here you can see the rocks. If you see, this is the original foundation stone. If you follow it, you could see that this is a complete circle.
So it actually makes a full circle that you can still see to this day. Well, perhaps not much to see nowadays, but this is where Nelson Mandela's well-intentioned teacher, who arguably through some misplaced loyalty, gave him a name that would stick, Nelson. Ironically, he went on to become more famous than his English namesake.
Mandela wrote that from an early age he spent most of his free time in the veld, playing with other boys. High-performance cars went around then. But as a child, Mandela recalls careering down smooth rocks in the hills above Qunu. They were known as sliding stones.
I can imagine for a kid it's pretty daunting, but when your bones are getting old, it's doubly so. It's only about 40 meters, but it's going to be a long 40 meters. Here goes.
Another popular pastime was stick fighting. Most young boys were potential warriors, so it was more than just a game. They learned valuable combat skills, how to attack and defend, or how to strategize in the thick of battle. Mandela described stick fighting as essential knowledge. It's all but disappeared now, but Zimisele Hempi still trains a handful of would-be gladiators in this African martial art. Mandela said he became adept at the various techniques in stick fighting, parrying blows, feinting in one direction and striking in another, breaking away from an opponent with quick footwork. But things could get a little ugly at times.
Wayengumuntu othanda udlala intonga umqaphela kwami wayenehempe ende uzomqaphela kwami kwela xesha labo ke babenganxibi izibhlukhwe babethatha izibhlukhwe ezihempe zotata babo esikolweni banxibe zotata babo esikolweni abathengelwa ihempe emlinganayo unalo hempe ke uthanda ukolusa ke ngapha ngasezixhotyeni buye ngexesha ke kuthi uguzukile uyawubethwa ke kodwa kuye yonke le nto besenzana inkomo beziphi bezitya amasimi abantu uzawubethwa ke ngoku kodwa uguzukile eguzukile njalo.
Mandela's relatively carefree days in the rolling hills around Qunu came to an abrupt end when his father died from lung disease. He's buried in Qunu in the family graveyard, close to his wife. Realizing his days were numbered, Gadla prevailed on his friend, the regent of the Tembu people, Jongintabo Dalindyebo, to look after his young son. It's not clear why Mandela, of all Gadla's children, was singled out for such special treatment. But Mandela's subsequent relationship with the Tembu royal family was to have a marked influence on both his character and his fortunes. Once again, we're dodging potholes and livestock. This is the road to Mqekezweni, where Jongintaba, the man who was to become Mandela's new father figure, maintained his great place.
As you can see, the trees there and the white building is next to the great place where Nelson Mandela was taken to by his mother after his father died when he was 9 years.
Right, yeah. I can see it just through the trees there.
Yes, it's there in Mqekezweni.
Jongintaba was appointed acting king of the Tembus because the heir apparent, Sabata, was too young to rule. Consequently, Mqekezweni was the provisional capital of Thembuland.
And would there have been villages around the Great Place at the time? Villages like this?
Yeah, I think so. There were villages like this for that time.
So this would have been the centre of power in Thembuland?
Yes, it is.
In truth, the takeover by whites had deprived the Thembu rulers of any real authority. But they continued to conduct traditional courts and exercise some authority over the distribution of land under their control. Tribal meetings were held under these trees, where even Jongan Taba could be admonished by his subjects.
Mandela then was young. He used to hide on the other side of the kraal, listening to the elders here. That's where he got wisdom. Yes.
For instance, if somebody stole somebody else's cattle or whatever, and they arrested the person, would that person be brought here?
Brought here, not to the magistrate.
Okay.
Yeah, he was sentenced here.
And what sort of sentence would he have received for stealing cattle?
Maybe going to be sentenced an ox.
Oh, he would have to pay an ox.
Pay an ox.
That would be a fine.
That will be a fine, or two oxen.
Or more.
Yeah, or more.
Yeah.
It depends on the weight of the case.
Okay, and I imagine they also settled land disputes here.
Yeah, land dispute.
Right.
They were settled here.
Okay.
There's no other place.
Mandela claims that his own notions of leadership were substantially shaped by what he observed at the Great Place. He greatly admired the consensual decision-making, although in later political life, he occasionally acted unilaterally, even if this clashed with his ideals.
And my grandfather tells a lot of tales about the olden days and about how the kingdom used to be. And it has changed today. It's not what it used to be in the past, you know. In the past, it used to be about collective leadership, but today we seem to be focusing on individuals, and individuals seem to think that they form the kingship. And that's what my grandfather has been really against throughout his life, that leadership is about a collective contribution of the masses.
Mqekezweni was an entirely new world for Mandela, and he admitted that many of his established beliefs and loyalties began to ebb away. The Western-style houses among the rondavels at Mqekezweni were a sign of great wealth. One of the more offbeat recollections in Mandela's autobiography was of the wooden floors in these houses. He'd never seen such luxury. Mqekezweni was bustling on the day of our visit. Final preparations were being made for the installation of a new chief here too. There was quite a collection of people, all seeming to contribute to the arrangements. This is how Mandela must have experienced Mqekezweni. Days later, he was there himself for the installation ceremony. Some things had obviously changed, but the traditions, colour and vibrancy of the occasion must have thrown up lots of memories for him. It was in this rural atmosphere that the African notion of human brotherhood, or Ubuntu, made an impact on Mandela. Ubuntu provides the basis of the Xhosa people's intricate code of social laws. A difficult concept for some outsiders to grasp. It suggests that your humanity is derived from how you interact with others. A person is a person through other people, is how it's sometimes explained. Mandela described Jongan Taba, his new father figure, as a man with a sturdy presence, upon whom all eyes gazed. Looking at this photo, you can see what he meant. Alongside Jongan Taba is a picture of his son, Justice, 4 years Mandela's senior. Very much a role model for the young Mandela, he was an all-round sportsman and ladies' man of note. Mandela, 19 years old when this picture was taken, is showing off his first suit. Like his royal guardian, Mandela was very clothes conscious. The photo collection belongs to Justice's widow, Nozalile Mtekhankha. Justice died many years ago, but his wife was not forgotten by the man who helped change the course of South African history. For Mandela, the church at Mqekezweni played an unwitting role in his first serious romance. It was during a service here that he took a shine to the Methodist minister's daughter. Her name was Winnie Matiolo, not to be confused with Winnie Madikizela, who featured so prominently in Mandela's later life. More than just a teenage fling, Mandela wrote about it in Long Walk to Freedom.
Kodwa ukhohlahla ngevana loo nto ufile ngumuntu ophandleni mna yiyo ndandingava umama istrict sasifihla.
Winnie's father was also a formidable man, a fire and brimstone preacher, as Mandela recalls. But this didn't stop Mandela from raiding the Reverend's Millie Patch.
Sidiva nje yokuthetha ndasazi babona
Bafana Magadla's memory also stretches back a long time. He's now an elder at Mqekezweni. He can remember Mandela having a rebellious streak, especially when he and Justice got together.
Ndikhumbula okokuba babefunda apha eMqekezweni beyalwa sisifa uba bayalwa ukumkani uJongintaba esithi fundani Justice Holhlahla fundani ilizwe egqibeleni lizawuphathwa nini. Ndikhumbula zonto awayezithetha. Kwenzeka ke ngokukhula kakuhle kwabo bathatha imoto bayidrayiva kanti abana-license babanjwa.
Ngathi abantu unawulela nonyana kaJongintaba uJustice ezonwabele nje kuhanjwa nezinto athi tjena ezinto zabaqaba on a Saturday kuyiwe ke nyasike ibholoho ababekele ibholoho ke asisiva uJustice inyana kaJongintaba wayebe umpu kayise the people who called double barrel ayi napha nasike amaqabo yikeke ake kudlalwe kakuhle mna ke andiyazi into ngezonto seyiva nje xa sincokola.
For the most part, though, Mandela seemed to conform to the expectations of his guardian. He went through the ritual circumcision that marks a Xhosa boy's transition to manhood. According to Xhosa tradition, an uncircumcised male can't inherit his father's wealth, marry, or officiate in tribal rituals. Mandela, together with his adoptive brother Justice, was brought to the secluded valley on the banks of the Mbashi River. Known as Chilaga, it's the traditional place of circumcision for Tembu royalty. They lived here for a while, isolated from society. Mandela said it was a kind of spiritual preparation for the trials of manhood that lay ahead.
The initiation ceremony was obviously a physical ordeal for the young man. The circumcision was carried out using an assegai or spear, and it was a disgrace to cry out in pain. Nelson Mandela remembers it taking ages for him to regain his composure before shouting out Indian Daughter, which means I am a man.
Some apparently well-intentioned remarks at the initiation ceremony by Jongintaba's brother, Chief Meleqeli, added to Mandela's discomfort. Chief Meleqeli said although ritual circumcision promised them manhood, it was an empty and illusory promise, because under white rule, they had no control over their destiny. Mandela initially dismissed the comments. He regarded the white man then as a benefactor, not an oppressor. But in time, he said, the chief's words began to work on him. By now, Mandela's future had been mapped out. Jongan Thaba wanted him to continue his education until he was fit to serve as a royal councillor, just like his father. Many young men of Mandela's generation received only rudimentary schooling. Most had none at all.
Ayabonakala uba ngawesikolo. Isuka apha ephithini ayibophelelanga le nto itshifu apha entloko ihamba njengoba ndinje. Inkwanga yesikolo efundayo. Kwakukuhle bafunda abafundayo. Kuba wafunda omnye wabo owayekunye nabo uKD. Wafunda yena wade wayinto. Wade wayi-prime minister yena ngenxa yofunda.
Bafana Magadla is explaining the sharp cleavage that existed in Xhosa society at the time. A distinction was made between pagan red people and Christian school people. The red were largely conservative traditionalists, while the school had been westernized to a degree. Mandela was decidedly school. Since Jongan Thaba was a committed Methodist, it was inevitable he'd send Mandela to his own alma mater, Clarkbury. The school was set up by pioneering Methodist missionaries who penetrated the Eastern Cape along with the invading British armies. The Xhosas tended to view the missionaries with ambivalence, part suspicious, part grateful. They were seen as agents of British imperialism, but who helped produce a new class of well-educated young Xhosas, many of whom became involved in the political struggles of later years. In fact, the area is regarded as the cradle of African nationalism, largely because missionary endeavours, including education, began here earlier and more intensively than anywhere else. In its heyday, Clarkbury was the biggest educational institution in Tembuland. But the decaying buildings are hard to reconcile with an illustrious past. Clarkbury went into a terminal decline when the apartheid government withdrew funding from church schools in the 1950s. Today, a small school in several refurbished buildings retains some continuity with the past. Mandela stayed in the double-storey hostel, which dominated the top end of the campus. Only the shell now remains.
Nelson Mandela's room in this hostel was in the upper wing there. The building was vacated in the late 1980s when pupils were relocated to a dormitory down the road. The building rapidly fell into rack and ruin. Apparently 2 boys set it alight when they tried to smoke out a swarm of bees, and locals plundered it for building materials like windows and doors.
Mandela's pride took a bit of a battering at Clarkbury. When he first arrived, he made a fool of himself as he struggled to walk in the first pair of boots he'd ever worn. After the deference he'd experienced at Mqekazweni, he was suddenly being treated like everyone else. There were plenty of other boys there with distinguished lineages. By his own admission, Mandela had a lot of catching up to do. Most of his classmates could outrun him on the playing field and outthink him in the classroom. The principal, Reverend Cecil Harris, was a tough disciplinarian who ran Clarkbury more like a military institution. Mandela got to know him intimately. He spent hours tending Reverend Harris's garden after Jongan Thaba asked him to take Mandela under his wing.
There's not much evidence of a garden here, but this is where the Reverend Harris deigned to allow the young Mandela to work as a special kind of privilege instead of doing other manual labour with the rest of the pupils from Clarkbury. Mrs. Harris would come out of the kitchen with tea and scones and chat with Mandela. In fact, the Harris family was the first white family with whom Mandela became familiar.
Healdtown, the other elite Methodist educational institution where Mandela completed his schooling, is also quite a wreck. Like Clarkbury, some restoration work is being carried out, but many of the buildings appear beyond saving. In Mandela's time, the ivy-covered walls and tree-shaded courtyards gave it the feeling of a privileged academic oasis. Even if some pupils didn't excel, Healdtown's founding fathers seemed intent that all who studied here should set their sights high. The school motto, translated from Latin, reads, "They soar as if with the wings of eagles." Mandela is in this battered old photo from Healdtown. Amazingly, it came to light only recently and is the oldest known picture of Mandela. The white man at the centre is Arthur Wellington, headmaster of Healdtown. He was a staunch English patriot who liked to boast about his connection to the Duke of Wellington, the British general who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. The British world view permeated Healdtown, and an English education model provided the basis for all teaching. Lapsing into your home language was a punishable offence.
Walking in the grounds there in Healdtown, you must speak English. If a prefect passes us talking our own language, you are charged and you are penalized. You go to and work labor, do some labor work at a certain time, say on a weekend and so on.
Sundays at Healdtown provided a vivid display of how comfortably the imperialist and missionary traditions coexisted. The boys and girls assembled under a Union Jack and marched to church accompanied by a brass band. Although Mandela was very proud of his own culture, he could see the benefits of a liberal English education. Janiko Njukweni was at Healdtown with Mandela. He remembers Mandela somewhat precociously exhorting his classmates to study harder.
Before the students wrote their examinations, he would encourage them at the boys' hostel. He would stand up, go to the stage and address the students, encouraging them when they were going to write the examinations.
Encouraging them to study?
Encouraging them to study and encouraging them to write well.
So he was something of a motivator even then?
Yes. He was a good student.
Mandela was appointed a prefect in his second year at Healdtown. Night duty involved patrolling in front of his dormitory here to apprehend fellow pupils who, in typical schoolboy fashion, insisted on relieving themselves from the veranda instead of going to the outside toilet. The housemaster was Reverend Seth Mokatimi. He impressed Mandela by standing up to the autocratic headmaster, demonstrating, Mandela said, that a black man did not have to defer automatically to a white, however senior he was. But Mandela's most memorable experience at Healdtown was during a school assembly in the dining hall. Dr. Wellington always made a grand entrance through Wellington's door, so-called because no one ever walked through it except Dr. Wellington. One morning, however, a black man in a leopard skin kaross, clutching two spears, led the way, with Dr. Wellington following. He was the famous Xhosa poet Samuel Mqhayi, whose writing was a major source of inspiration for early African nationalists.
Mandela said when Samuel Mqhayi rose to speak, he was initially disappointed. He wasn't terribly distinguished looking, and apart from his clothes, was quite ordinary. But Mandela said he could hardly believe his ears when, in the presence of Dr. Wellington and other whites, Mqhayi spoke about blacks having succumbed to the false gods of the white man for too long.
Mqhayi was also renowned for his performance as an imbongi, a praise singer who marks important events with poetry in an often exaggerated manner. He raged against foreign culture, predicting how the forces of African society would eventually overcome it. This got the audience onto their feet, clapping and cheering. Mandela said Mqhayi's performance was like a comet streaking across the night sky, and he began to alter his perceptions of white men like Dr. Wellington. Many years later, he would still pay tribute to the missionaries who educated him, even if they had ulterior motives.
At a time when the government took no interest whatsoever in our education, it was the churches that established schools, right from sub-A up to the university. All these were church schools established and financed by the church. Therefore, religion is in our blood, and that is why we are so emotional when we talk about the church.
Mandela was only vaguely interested in politics as a young man. Even when he went on to university, his heart was set on a conservative professional career as a court interpreter, which carried much status in rural areas. The South African Native College at Fort Hare, as it was then known, was the only black university in the country. Here's Mandela's name in the students' register. Mandela was proud to get into Fort Hare. In his memoirs, he remarked that for black South Africans, Fort Hare was Oxford and Cambridge, Harvard and Yale, all rolled into one. He also described it as home and incubator of some of Africa's greatest scholars. Mandela particularly admired this man, Julie Jabavu, Fort Hare's first black professor. Something of a rarity according to Mandela, he had a degree in English from London University, but he was also a strong proponent of African rights. Mandela stayed in the Methodist hostel Wesley House on the edge of the campus. What remains of the original building is presumably making way for something bigger and better. Mandela's elder cousin, Kaiser Matanzima, was a fellow resident at Wesley House. The two became political enemies in later years when Matanzima sided with the apartheid authorities. But at Fort Hare, they were inseparable. Matanzima shared his money with Mandela and actively encouraged him to concentrate on law. Mandela is being helped here into the striped blazer of his alma mater. He was receiving Fort Hare's top honor, along with other famous alumni, including the Zulu leader Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi, whose politics diverged from many of his student contemporaries.
You must remember the whole of Southern Africa was not liberated at that time. And therefore, all of us, were bound to think alike as far as what to do about our oppression, what to do about liberation of our country.
Although Mandela's prospects at Fort Hare were good, his stay was abruptly terminated after a show of rebelliousness. He became embroiled in a row about the university's perennially poor food and the powers of the Students' Representative Council. The principal, Dr. Alexander Kerr, gave Mandela an ultimatum, but Mandela rejected it, admitting later he was as surprised as Dr. Kerr by his action. Back at Mqhekezweni, John Gintaba was preparing his own surprise for Mandela. He was planning arranged marriages for Mandela and his own son Justice. This wasn't what they had in mind. They decided to defy the regent and try their luck in Johannesburg. If this wasn't enough, they stole 2 of his best oxen to fund their escapade. Nozalile Mtekgaga, who of course eventually became Justice's wife, remembers how shocked people were.
Ngapha ekhaya seva into ukubana umkile. Esimele noba uRholihlahla bemnkabakhwela bapheke eGauteng bebakhe inkomo zikabawo bemkanaso bafuna imali ngazo. Ekuhambeni kwabo ke bephaya emazweni. Ndifumanisa into kokubana babefikele kumzi omnye. Bathi bakuba befikele kulomzi kwacaca into kubana lo mzi unentokazi ezinhle. Kwacaca ba lo wamsengenile kwelikhaya. Wathi uba uRholihlahla hayibo masingaqale sibe nento esiyenzayo kwintombi zalapha kuba ezi ntokazi zinabantu bazo sakuba sengxakini.
This is the rondavel that Mandela and Justice shared at Mqhekezweni, probably where they hatched their audacious plan to flee to Johannesburg. It was no way to repay John Gintaba's kindness, biting the proverbial hand that had fed them. But the young men couldn't allow themselves to succumb to an attack of conscience. For Mandela, the decision to start a new life in the country's largest city would obviously have much greater repercussions than he or anybody realized at the time. Much of what he learnt here would go with him and become part of the Mandela icon.
Nelson Mandela had an extraordinary ability to combine traditional and modern values. This probably explains why he appealed to such a broad cross-section of people. There's little doubt that his formative years in this part of the world helped shape the man who was to become South Africa's greatest leader.
It's been a long time since a train passed through this station. This is where Mandela and Justice attempted to set out on their long trip to Johannesburg. But Jonken Taba was one step ahead of them. He suspected they were up to something and instructed the station master not to sell them tickets. With the regent breathing down their necks, they raced off to another station where they wouldn't be recognized. Mandela was on the run, and it wouldn't be the only time in his life.